Never be kind to strangers. That's the rule of survival in Boston. Don't look, don't ask, don't care. Because in this city, kindness can get you killed. Rosa Hayward broke all 3 rules. Let her go. His voice cut through the darkness, colder than Boston's February ice. 3 black cars blocked the road. 12 men in black suits stepped out in unison, lining up like shadows. Jerome froze. He stared at the man emerging from the middle car, and everything inside him turned to ice. He knew that face. All of Boston did. But that comes later. 3 months ago, Weston Draven was just an ordinary customer, walking into her small watch shop in an old jacket, carrying a watch that had stopped beating long ago. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that her promise to fix that watch would push her to the edge of death. And she certainly didn't know that he would burn the entire city down to save her. If you want to know where fate takes Rosa and Weston, hit like and share this story. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. 3 months earlier, in the first days of November, Boston's North End lay under the first bite of winter cold. The snow hadn't fallen heavily yet, but the wind was already sharp enough to make people draw their necks deeper into their coats each time they stepped outside. Among the old brick-paved streets, tucked modestly into the corner of a 3-story red brick building that had stood there since the beginning of the last century, there was a small shop with a wooden sign weathered pale by time. The words Hayward & Sons timepieces could still be read, but the 2 words and Sons had faded so badly that they nearly disappeared into the grain of the wood, as though time itself were slowly erasing a promise that had never been fulfilled. Inside the shop, hundreds of clocks hung on the walls, rested in glass cabinets, and lined the oak shelves, all of them ticking together in a strange kind of chorus whose beauty could only be felt by those who truly loved the craft. The scent of machine oil mingled with the smell of old wood and metal, creating a fragrance all its own. The very fragrance Rosa Hayward had been breathing in for 17 years, ever since she was a 10-year-old girl, standing on a stool to watch her grandfather work. Rosa was 27 years old, with Italian blood from her mother's side. She had ivory fair skin dusted with faint freckles across the bridge of her nose, as though someone had carelessly scattered cinnamon there. Her chestnut brown hair was usually pinned into a loose knot at the nape of her neck while she worked, revealing a slender neck and small shoulders that still held themselves straight. Her eyes were the most striking feature of her face, a gray-blue like the sea before a storm, gentle and yet carrying something deep within them that wasn't easy to read. She usually wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and over it a dark brown leather apron with many small pockets for tools. Her hands were small but astonishingly nimble, her long fingers marked with calluses on the tips of her index finger and thumb, the traces of thousands of hours spent holding tweezers and screwdrivers. Rosa had a gift that her grandfather used to call the ears of a master clockmaker. She could listen to the ticking of a clock and know exactly which part was failing, which gear was wearing down, which spring was losing its strength. It was a family trade, passed down to her by her grandfather Antonio from the time she was little. He used to tell her in his thick Italian accent that every clock was a heart, and their job was to keep it beating. That sentence had stayed with Rosa through all the passing years, becoming the guiding principle behind everything she did. But life isn't always gentle with good people. Rosa lived alone in the tiny studio apartment just behind the shop, where the ticking of clocks was the only sound she heard each night before she drifted to sleep. Her mother, Penny Hayward, was lying in St. Mary's Hospital with heart disease, the illness that had tormented her for the past 2 years. Her grandfather Antonio had died 2 years earlier, leaving her this shop along with a debt of $80,000, money he had borrowed to pay for treatment for his wife before she passed away. Rosa had managed to save $25,000 over those 2 years, but that sum was still far too small compared to what she needed. Worse still, her shop stood in a place people in the trade called the gray zone, the boundary between the territories of the 2 most powerful organizations in Boston. That meant no one protected her, but no one paid much attention to her either, at least, not until now. Every day in Rosa's life began at 8 o'clock in the morning when she turned the closed sign to open, and ended at 7 o'clock in the evening when she turned it back again. 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, she sat behind her grandfather's old workbench, repairing the clocks people brought in. She had no friends, no lover, no one to call in the evening. The only person who often stopped by was Bernie, the 70-year-old owner of the grocery shop right next door. He usually brought her a cup of coffee in the morning and asked a few kind questions. and that was the sum of Rosa's social interaction for the day. That afternoon, as Rosa sat by the window watching the first snowflakes begin to fall, laying a thin white veil over the Boston sidewalk, she didn't know that her life was about to change completely. And then, the doorbell rang. The clock on the wall showed 5 o'clock in the evening when the doorbell rang. Outside, the sky had already gone dark, Boston winter swallowing the daylight far too early. A rush of cold wind spilled into the shop, carrying with it a few fine snowflakes. Rosa looked up from the clock she had been repairing and saw a tall man standing in the doorway, his silhouette nearly blocking the entire glass frame. He wore an old black leather bomber jacket, a simple gray t-shirt underneath, dark cargo pants, and a pair of clean but not new sneakers. There was nothing remarkable about his clothes, nothing that spoke of money or power. He looked like any man you might pass on a Boston street on a winter afternoon. But Rosa had lived long enough to know that appearances were often the easiest things to be fooled by. The man was about 33 years old, at least 6 feet 2 inches tall. His skin was pale with a cool undertone, as if sunlight had never truly touched him. His hair was black as ink and combed neatly back, though a few stubborn strands had still fallen across his forehead. And his eyes, those eyes were what made Rosa stop breathing for a second. Ice blue, blue like a glacier in the heart of winter, beautiful and cold at the same time. A faint scar ran along the right side of his chin, not taking away from his looks but giving even more edge to a face that was already sharply cut. Even the way he stood was unusual, shoulders straight but not tense, arms relaxed at his sides, the posture of a man who was always ready for whatever might happen. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped to the counter and set down a pocket watch. Rosa looked at it and immediately knew this wasn't some ordinary object. The watch had a silver case worn by time, and the glass face bore a small crack running across the number 6. She picked it up carefully, turned it over to examine the back, and her heart quickened by a beat. This was an antique Swiss watch, at least 50 years old, perhaps older. The kind of watch no one made anymore, the kind collectors would pay thousands of dollars to own. But from its condition, Rosa knew this watch wasn't meant to be sold. It had been preserved, carried, loved, even though it had long been broken. She looked up at the man. "This means a lot to you, doesn't it?" He was silent for a moment, those ice-blue eyes resting on the watch in her hand with an emotion Rosa couldn't name. Then he answered, his voice low and even. "More than anything I own." Rosa nodded and didn't ask another question. She pushed the magnifying loupe up onto her forehead, pulled the desk lamp closer, and carefully opened the back of the watch. The movement inside revealed itself, intricate and complex like a miniature work of art, but it was badly damaged too. Several gears were worn down, the mainspring had weakened, and the balance staff needed to be replaced. Rosa touched each part with her fingertips, gently, as if she were touching something sacred. She could feel the history in this watch, the years it had passed through, the hands that had once held it. When she looked up, she realized the man was watching her work with an expression entirely different from the one he had worn when he first walked in. No longer cold. There was something softer now in those frozen eyes. "I'll need at least 3 weeks," Rosa said. "Maybe longer. Some of the parts are very hard to find." "However long it takes," he answered without the slightest hesitation. Rosa nodded and gave him the price. $30 for the initial inspection, with the rest to be calculated after she determined what needed replacing. But instead of handing over $30, the man placed a $100 bill on the counter and turned to walk toward the door. Rosa quickly spoke up. "You gave me too much." He didn't turn back. He only paused for a second at the door and said over his shoulder, "Keep it." Then he stepped outside, the door closing behind him, the bell ringing once more before falling silent. Rosa stood there, looking at the glass door, still clouded with the cold from outside. One hand still held the $100 bill. The other rested on the antique watch. There was something about this man she couldn't forget, couldn't push from her mind no matter how hard she tried to return to her work. It wasn't his cold beauty. It wasn't his unusual generosity. It was the way he had looked at the watch while it lay in her hand. That look, Rosa had seen it before, in the mirror, every time she looked at the things her grandfather had left behind. It was the way people looked at something that had belonged to someone who was gone, someone they still missed every single day. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that he would come back, every day, for 3 months. The following afternoon, right on time as if it had been arranged in advance, The doorbell rang again, and that man walked in. Rosa looked up from her workbench, unable to hide her surprise. "You're back early. I haven't finished it yet." Weston stood by the door for a moment, as if searching for a reason for his own presence. "I know. I just wanted to see the progress." Then he walked over to the old wooden chair in the corner of the shop, sat down, and said nothing more. He simply sat there, quietly watching her work amid the ticking of hundreds of clocks. And that was how everything began. Every afternoon, when the light outside started to fade and the Boston street lamps flickered on one by one, Weston appeared again. He never called ahead, never gave any notice, but he was never absent either. He sat in the chair in the corner of the shop, sometimes reading an old book from the shelf, sometimes simply closing his eyes and listening to the clocks. He didn't talk much, and Rosa gradually came to understand that his silence wasn't coldness, but comfort. He didn't need to speak, and she didn't need him to. After a few days, Rosa began preparing a cup of unsweetened black tea before he arrived. She placed it on the small table beside his chair, and Weston never asked how she knew what he liked. He simply drank it all, every single time. As time passed, Rosa began telling him about her life, in small pieces, in brief stories. She told him about her grandfather Antonio, about the way he had taught her to repair clocks, about his philosophy that every clock was a heart that needed care. Weston listened, nodding now and then, sometimes smiling faintly when she told him something amusing, but he never spoke about himself. No full name, no occupation, no family, no past. Rosa didn't ask. In Boston, she had learned that sometimes not asking was the highest form of respect, and strangely, between them there was an ease inside silence that Rosa had never found with anyone else. 3 weeks later, Rosa called him, her voice unable to hide a small note of pride. "Your watch is finished." Weston came that same afternoon. She placed the watch in his hand, the glass newly replaced, the movement inside running steadily and precisely. He looked at it for a long moment, his thumb slowly brushing across the dial. Rosa told him the price, $30 for the service. Weston placed $100 on the counter. She tried to return $70, but he shook his head. "Keep it." And she thought that would be the last time she saw him. But the next day, at the same hour as always, the bell rang again. Weston walked in with another watch in his hand, set it on the counter, and said it needed to be checked. Rosa picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and knew at once that there was nothing wrong with it. The movement was perfect, the time exact, not a single detail needed repair. She looked up at him, and he looked back at her with those ice-blue eyes, offering no explanation, giving no reason. Rosa didn't ask. She simply nodded, accepted the watch, and said she would inspect it carefully. One afternoon, Rosa looked through the glass door and saw a red-haired man standing beside a black car waiting for Weston. The man wore a suit, tall and lean, his expression calm in the way of someone long accustomed to waiting. Before Weston got into the car, the red-haired man stepped into Bernie's grocery shop. Rosa couldn't hear what they said, but she saw him hand Bernie a small business card. Bernie looked down at the card, then over at Rosa's shop, then back at the red-haired man. He didn't ask anything. In Boston, people learned not to ask questions when the answers might bring them trouble. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Rosa was bent over a complicated clock, her eyes tired, and her hands beginning to tremble slightly from working too long without rest. She didn't realize Weston had stood up until his hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder. "Take a break." His voice was low and gentle, not an order but something closer to a quiet request. Rosa looked up, and for the first time, she realized how close they were standing. She could see every strand of black hair that had fallen across his forehead, could see the faint scar on his chin, could see those ice-blue eyes looking at her with something entirely different from his usual coldness. That moment lasted a few seconds, or perhaps an entire lifetime. Then Weston stepped back, returned to his chair, and neither of them said a word about what had just happened. 3 months passed as though they were only one long day, and Rosa still didn't know who he was, but someone else did, and he was coming. That morning began like any other. Rosa turned the sign to open at 8 o'clock, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat down at her workbench. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the sidewalk was still covered with a thin white layer. She had just picked up the first clock of the day when the sound of a car engine came from out front. A glossy black SUV pulled up hard right in front of the shop. the kind of expensive vehicle people rarely saw in this part of the neighborhood. 3 men stepped out, and Rosa knew at once these weren't ordinary customers. The one in front was a man of about 45, medium height but heavily overweight, his swollen belly stretching the fabric of an expensive dress shirt. His face was flushed red like a man who had spent years drinking too much, and his large nose and thin lips gave him a look that was both coarse and sly. His dirty blonde hair had thinned badly at the crown and was combed back in a hopeless effort to hide the baldness. Around his neck hung a thick gold chain, and gold rings glittered on his fingers, as if he were afraid people might not realize he had money. When he smiled, a gold-capped tooth in his upper jaw flashed beneath the light of the shop. He walked in, his piggish eyes moving around the store as though he were appraising every clock on the wall, every floorboard beneath his feet. His 2 men stood blocking the entrance at once, their arms folded across their chests, their faces cold as stone. Rosa rose from behind the counter, instinct making her tighten her grip on the screwdriver still in her hand. She tried to keep her voice calm. The fat man stopped in front of the counter, his smile still in place. "You're old Hayward's granddaughter?" Rosa looked straight into his eyes. "What do you want?" He laughed louder, the hoarse sound echoing through the quiet shop. "Direct. I like that. My name is Jerome Langley. Maybe you've heard of me." Rosa didn't answer, but she knew the name. Everyone in the North End knew that name. Jerome placed a stack of papers on the counter right in front of Rosa. She looked down and recognized them at once as a loan agreement. Her grandfather Antonio's signature at the bottom of the page, the shaky handwriting of an old man in despair. Jerome tapped a finger against the papers. "Your grandfather borrowed $80,000 from me 3 years ago to pay for his wife's treatment. With interest, it's $110,000 now. You've got 30 days. Rosa felt as if someone had just punched her in the stomach. She knew about the debt, but she hadn't known it belonged to Jerome Langley. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I don't have that kind of money." Jerome tilted his head, the smile still on his lips, though his eyes turned colder. "Then we've got a problem, little girl." He began walking around the shop, running his hand along the clock shelves and the glass cabinets, as if he were inspecting property that already belonged to him. Nice location. Corner lot, close to downtown, neighborhoods going up in value. This shop is worth more than the debt, you know that? Rosa straightened her back a little more. This shop isn't for sale. Jerome turned to look at her, his gaze like the gaze of a snake studying its prey. "Everything has a price, little girl. Everything." He walked closer to the counter, placed both hands on the glass, and leaned toward Rosa. 30 days. If not, I'll find my own way to collect." Then he straightened up and adjusted his collar as if they had just been discussing the weather. He headed for the door, but stopped with his hand already on the knob. "Oh, one more thing." He turned back to Rosa, his tone as gentle as if he were asking after an old friend's health. "Your mother is at St. Mary's Hospital, isn't she? Room 412, if I remember correctly?" Rosa went completely still. Her heart seemed to miss a beat. Jerome smiled, his gold tooth catching the light. "Just asking after her. Have a nice day." Then he walked out, his 2 men following behind him, the door closing, the sound of the engine fading into the distance and disappearing. Rosa dropped back into her chair, her legs trembling so badly she couldn't have stayed standing. She looked down at her hand and saw that the screwdriver was still in her palm, the joints of her fingers white from how tightly she had been gripping it. The bell over the door rang and Bernie appeared, the old man's face full of worry. "Are you all right? I saw those men coming out of your shop." Rosa looked up, forcing out a smile. "I'm fine, Bernie. It's just old business." The old man looked at her for a long moment, clearly not believing her, but he didn't ask any more questions. In Boston, people learned not to ask questions whose answers they didn't want to know. He only nodded, told her to call if she needed anything, then returned to his grocery store. Rosa sat alone in the silent shop, the ticking of the clock sounding like a countdown. 30 days, and she had no idea what to do. 7 days after Jerome's visit, Rosa was jolted awake at 2 o'clock in the morning by the sound of shattering glass. She sprang out of bed, her heart pounding wildly, and ran toward the shop. The sight before her made her stop cold. The large front window had been smashed to pieces, shards of broken glass scattered across the floor, glittering beneath the streetlight spilling in from outside. In the middle of the wreckage lay a brick, and wrapped around it with a rubber band was a small piece of paper. Rosa stepped forward, her bare feet pressing onto tiny splinters of glass that she didn't even notice. She bent down and picked up the note, her hand trembling. 2 words had been scrawled across it in black ink. 25 days. Rosa stood there in the middle of her shop, in the middle of the ruin, in the middle of the November cold pouring through the empty frame, and she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Rosa cleaned up the broken glass and called someone to install a new door. Bernie came hurrying over the moment he saw the scene, his old face full of worry. "What happened, kid?" Rosa didn't look at him, her hand still sweeping the last bits of glass into the dustpan. "Probably just some kids messing around. Bernie, it's nothing." The old man watched her for a long moment, his wrinkled eyes holding a suspicion he didn't speak aloud. He didn't believe her. Rosa knew he didn't believe her, but he didn't ask anything more. When the new glass door had been installed, Rosa turned the sign to open, as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, Weston walked in and stopped right at the entrance. His ice-blue eyes swept over the new glass frame, over the faint scratches on the wooden floor that Rosa hadn't had time to polish away. "What happened to the window?" Rosa was bent over her workbench, and she didn't look up, didn't look at him. "Just an accident. It's nothing." Her voice was so calm that even she was surprised by how smoothly she could lie. Weston stood there for a moment in silence. Rosa knew he was looking at her, knew he didn't believe a word she had just said, but he didn't push. He simply walked to the familiar chair in the corner of the shop, sat down, and picked up the book she had left there for him the day before. That night, after leaving Rosa's shop, Weston sat in the black car parked a few blocks away and made a phone call. His voice was cold and brief. "Hugh, put people on the watch shop in the North End, 24/7. On the other end, the red-haired man's voice answered without a trace of surprise. "Understood." From that night on, there was always a black car parked 2 blocks away from Rosa's shop, silent as a shadow. In the days that followed, Rosa noticed something even more alarming than the broken window. Her customers were disappearing. The familiar people who used to bring in watches for repair every month now walked past the shop without stopping. New orders dried up completely. She overheard the whispers from the neighboring businesses, the stories told behind her back. "Don't get involved with that place. Jerome Langley has his eye on it." Jerome's name spread through the neighborhood like a sickness, and no one wanted to stand too close to the infected. Her income dropped so sharply that Rosa had to start taking on extra repair work online, staying up deep into the night to finish orders from customers in other states, people who didn't know and didn't care who she was or who was threatening her. But every afternoon, the bell still rang and Weston still walked in. He was the only customer she had left, the only one who still sat in the chair in the corner of the shop, still drank the unsweetened black tea Rosa prepared for him, still stayed quietly beside her in the midst of the ticking clocks. Rosa didn't ask why he kept coming when everyone else had chosen to stay away. She was simply grateful that in the middle of the storm rolling toward her, there was still one person who didn't run. 18 days remained, and Jerome wasn't finished. He had only just begun. On the 15th day, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a white truck pulled up hard in front of Rosa's shop. On the side of the vehicle, the words Boston Fire Department were printed in bold, official enough that anyone passing by would have believed it was a government vehicle. 2 men in blue uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand, their expressions stern as though they were carrying out the most important duty of their lives. The taller one entered the shop first and held up a plastic identification card in front of Rosa. "Fire Department. We've received a report of electrical safety violations at this establishment. We need to conduct an immediate inspection." Rosa stood from behind the counter, her palms beginning to sweat even though the weather was cold. "I didn't receive any notice about an inspection." The taller man didn't change his expression. "This is a surprise inspection, ma'am. We need to seize all electrical equipment temporarily for the safety investigation." Rosa stepped forward, her voice beginning to shake with anger. "You can't do that. This is my personal property. I need to see a warrant." The second man, shorter and heavier, stepped up beside his partner, still holding the clipboard. "You can call a lawyer if you want. While you're waiting, we still have to do our job. That's the regulation." They didn't wait for Rosa to protest again. The taller man walked straight to her workbench and began packing things into boxes. Rosa stood there helpless, watching each item be wrapped up and thrown into brown cartons. Her grandfather's magnifying loupe, the one he had bought from a German craftsman in 1965, the same loupe Rosa had used since the day she learned to repair her first clock, the 47-piece Swiss screwdriver set, the gift her grandmother had given him on their wedding day, every piece numbered and cared for like a treasure. The old desk lamp with its tarnished brass base, the lamp that had lit thousands of clocks over the course of his life. One item after another disappeared into those lifeless brown boxes. Rosa watched the shorter man carefully as he passed by her carrying another box out to the truck. And then she recognized him. He was one of the two men who had blocked the door the day Jerome came. That face, those cold eyes, Rosa had seen them before. She understood immediately. These weren't real inspectors. There were no electrical safety violations. This was Jerome. This was the way he played his filthy games. But Rosa couldn't do anything. She didn't have the money to hire a lawyer. She didn't have the power to fight back. All she could do was stand there and watch her life being packed up and taken away. When the truck finally pulled off, Rosa stepped outside and stood in the doorway, watching it until it turned the corner and disappeared. 30 years of memory. Her grandfather's legacy. The tools she had used to make a living, to keep this shop alive, to pay off debt and care for her mother. Everything. Gone in less than 30 minutes. Rosa didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago, from the day her grandfather died, from the day she realized that tears solved nothing in this world. The sound of hurried footsteps came, and Bernie appeared, his old face drawn tight with worry. "Sweetheart, what happened?" "I saw men in uniforms carrying things out to the truck." Rosa turned to look at him, her gray-blue eyes as empty as the shop now was. "They took everything, Bernie. Everything's gone." The old man didn't say anything. He only stepped forward and wrapped her in his arms, his wrinkled hand patting her back the way he did with his granddaughter whenever she cried. "There has to be a way, sweetheart. There has to be a way." Rosa shook her head inside his embrace, but said nothing. That afternoon, when Weston stepped into the shop, he stopped right at the doorway. The place was empty. Nothing remained on the workbench except the bare wood surface. The clock shelves were still there, but there were no tools, no lamp, nothing left to show that this had once been the workplace of a craftsman. Rosa was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall behind the counter, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on nothing. Weston didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to ask. He simply walked over, sat down on the floor beside her, leaned his back against the wall too, his shoulder close enough to almost touch hers. They sat there in silence, in the empty shop, in the midst of the ticking wall clocks that kept running as though nothing had changed. That night, after leaving the shop, Weston sat in his car and made a phone call. His voice was colder than the ice and snow outside. "Hugh, find out everything about Jerome Langley. Everything." On the 16th day, Rosa woke before dawn. She wouldn't allow herself to sit still and wait to die. She picked up her phone and called old acquaintances in the trade, people her grandfather had helped many years before. By noon, she had managed to borrow a few tools. Not complete, not nearly as good as what she had once owned, but enough to work with. An old magnifying loupe, a few basic screwdrivers, a cheap desk lamp. Rosa arranged them on her workbench, and even though the shop looked barer than ever, she still turned the sign to open as usual. The sign was still hanging there. The door was still open. She was still standing. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang. Rosa looked at the screen and saw the number for St. Mary's Hospital. Her heart tightened as she answered. "Miss Hayward, this is Dr. Turner, the physician in charge of your mother's case." His voice was grave, the kind of voice Rosa had learned to fear after years of going in and out of hospitals. "I'm calling to inform you about Penny's condition. Her health is declining more quickly than we expected. We need to perform heart surgery within 2 weeks." Rosa tightened her grip on the phone, her voice dry and thin. 2 weeks? Dr. Turner sighed on the other end of the line. "I understand that's very little time, but without the surgery, her heart won't hold out much longer." He paused for a moment before continuing, his tone softer, as though he knew what he was about to say would land like a knife. "The surgery will cost around $80,000. Insurance covers 50%. You'll need to prepare $40,000. In 2 weeks. Rosa ended the call, her hand shaking so badly that she had to set the phone down on the table so she wouldn't drop it. She drew in a deep breath, trying to steady herself, then dialed her mother's number. Penny's frail voice came through the speaker, but it was as warm as ever. "Sweetheart, are you all right? You haven't come to see me these past few days." Rosa swallowed the tears rising in her throat and tried to keep her voice normal. "I'm fine, Mom. Everything's fine. The shop has just been so busy that I haven't been able to come by. Penny was silent for a moment, then spoke, her voice slow and full of love. Don't worry too much about me. I'll be all right. Rosa closed her eyes, and a tear slipped down her cheek. You're going to get better, I promise. She ended the call, and once she no longer had to pretend, the tears simply fell, quiet and unstoppable. Rosa sat down at her workbench and took out a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote the numbers down, even though she had calculated them hundreds of times already in her mind. The money she had was $25,000, the sum she had managed to save over 2 years. The money needed for her mother's surgery was $40,000. The money she owed Jerome was $110,000. The time she had left was 14 days. She stared at the numbers on the paper, and the truth stood before her, clear and merciless. There was no way. Mathematics doesn't lie. That afternoon, Weston stepped into the shop as he always did. He saw Rosa sitting behind the counter, her eyes red even though she had tried to hide it by keeping her head lowered over her work. Weston didn't ask. He didn't say a single word. He simply walked toward the familiar chair, but instead of sitting down, he crossed to the small tea table in the corner of the room, where Rosa usually prepared tea for him each afternoon. Today, he poured the tea himself and carried it over to set it in front of her. Rosa looked up and met those ice-blue eyes, and in that moment, she almost told him everything. About Jerome, about the debt, about her mother, about the surgery, about the fact that she was drowning and didn't know what to hold on to. But she didn't. She only lowered her head again, murmured a quiet thank you, and went back to work. She didn't know that he already knew everything. Hugh had reported it all to Weston the night before. About Jerome, about the debt, about the men pretending to be inspectors, and now about her mother's surgery. Weston knew everything, but he said nothing. He was waiting to see whether she would come to him, whether she would ask for help. But Rosa Hayward wasn't the kind of woman who begged anyone for anything, and that was exactly what made it impossible for him to look away from her. On the 20th day, Jerome came back, but this time he came alone, with no men behind him and no glossy black SUV parked outside the door. He walked into the shop like an ordinary customer, the smile on his lips the same as always, the gold tooth gleaming beneath the light. Rosa stood behind the counter, her whole body tightening the instant she saw him. But she didn't step back. Jerome looked at her from head to toe, and there was no open threat in his eyes this time. In its place was something even more frightening, the false softness of a man pretending to care. You look tired, he said, his tone gentle as if he were speaking to an old acquaintance. I heard your mother is very sick. I'm sorry to hear that. Rosa didn't answer. She simply stood there looking at him, waiting. She knew he hadn't come to ask after anyone's health. Jerome stepped up to the counter, braced both hands on the glass, and leaned toward her. I have an offer for you. A fair offer. Rosa remained silent. He went on, speaking as though he were trying to persuade a child. Sign the papers transferring this shop to me. In return, I'll erase the entire $110,000 debt your grandfather left behind. And I'll give you another $20,000 in cash. Rosa blinked. 20,000? Jerome nodded, false generosity spreading across his fleshy face. Enough to cover your mother's surgery, isn't it? Insurance pays half. You need 40,000. You already have 25,000. Add my 20,000 and that's enough. He paused, letting the numbers settle into her mind. Think about it, Miss Hayward. What does this shop mean if your mother is gone? Rosa looked around the shop, the walls she had seen every day for the past 17 years. The clock still ticking steadily on the shelves, the bare work counter emptied of its tools after everything had been taken away, the customers who had abandoned her, the income that was nearly gone. She was drowning, and Jerome was throwing her a rope, $20,000, plus the debt erased. Her mother would get the surgery, her mother would live, all for one signature, just one signature. Jerome watched her expression, and he knew he was winning. He pulled a prepared document and an expensive pen from inside his coat and laid both on the counter in front of Rosa. Your grandfather is dead, Miss Hayward. This shop is only brick and cement. It doesn't breathe, it doesn't beat, and it can't love you back. But your mother is still alive. She's waiting for you at the hospital, fighting for one more day to see you. He pushed the paper toward her. 24 hours. Tomorrow morning, I'll come back. If you sign, it all ends. Your mother is saved, and you're free. If you don't." He gave a small shrug, and the smile faded from his lips. "I won't leave you anything at all." Then he turned and walked out of the shop without looking back. Rosa stood there staring at the paper on the counter, as though it were a venomous snake coiled and waiting. $20,000. The debt erased. Her mother would live. But this shop, the place her grandfather had spent 30 years building, the place he had created from nothing with his own 2 hands, the place where she had learned to love her craft, the place where she had found herself among the ticking of clocks. She sank down into the chair behind the counter, her head bowed, her forehead resting against the cold glass surface. She didn't know what to do. For the first time in her life, Rosa Hayward truly didn't know what to do. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the tiny apartment behind the shop with the lights off, the glow from the street outside stretching into long bars across the floor. On the wall opposite her, a photograph of her grandfather Antonio looked down at her, his kind smile unchanged by time. In the photograph, he was holding the first clock he had ever repaired successfully, his eyes bright with pride. Rosa stared at the picture and whispered into the darkness, "Grandpa, what am I supposed to do? I don't want to lose your shop, but I can't let Mom." Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish. The photograph gave no answer. Her grandfather was gone, and she would have to make this decision on her own. 24 hours. One signature. Her mother or her grandfather. Blood or memory. Rosa had never imagined she would be forced to choose between the 2 things she loved most in the world. On the morning of the 21st day, Rosa woke after a sleepless night. Her eyes were swollen, her head throbbed like it was being split apart, and when she lifted a hand to rub her face, she realized her fingers were shaking. She stepped out into the shop, and Jerome's paper was still lying there on the counter, waiting, patient like a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. Rosa stared at it for a long moment, then turned away, picked up her phone, and called the hospital. She asked about her mother's condition. The nurse's voice on the other end hesitated for a second before answering. "She's weaker than she was yesterday, Miss Hayward. Dr. Turner wants to speak with you about moving the surgery up sooner than planned, if possible." Rosa ended the call, her hand trembling so violently that she had to set the phone down on the counter to keep from dropping it. Her mother was growing weaker with each passing day, and she was standing here, helpless, with the devil's paper lying in front of her. Rosa walked to the counter and stood before the document. She looked at the printed lines, looked at the blank space at the bottom reserved for her signature. $20,000. The debt erased. Her mother would have the surgery. Her mother would live. She picked up the pen, and her hand was so cold it felt as though the blood had stopped moving through it. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice breaking in the quiet stillness of the shop. "I don't have any other choice." She lowered the pen to the paper, the tip touching the line meant for her name. Just one stroke, one signature, and it would all be over. Her mother would live. The shop would be gone. 30 years would vanish in a single second. And then she looked up. Her grandfather, Antonio's photograph, hung on the wall just above the register, where it had hung for so many years. In the picture, he was smiling, the same gentle smile she remembered perfectly, his hand holding the first clock he had ever repaired successfully. Rosa looked at that smile, and she heard his voice in her mind, as clearly as if he were standing right beside her. "Every clock is a heart, Rosa. Our job is to keep it beating." She looked back down at the paper before her, and suddenly she understood. This wasn't keeping a heart beating. This was crushing it to death. This shop was her grandfather's heart, the whole of the life he had built with his own 2 hands. He hadn't given up when his wife died. He hadn't given up when his health began to fail. He hadn't given up until his very last breath. And she, Rosa Hayward, Antonio Hayward's granddaughter, would not be the one to bury his legacy. Her hand was still shaking, but when she spoke, her voice didn't shake at all. No. One single word, ringing through the silent shop, firm and impossible to take back. She pushed the paper away, then picked it up, crushed it into a ball in her hand, and threw it into the trash can beside the counter. "I'll find another way," she said to herself, to her grandfather's photograph, to the clocks ticking all around her. There has to be another way. She didn't know what way. She had no plan, no money, no one standing beside her, but she refused to believe there was only one road, the road Jerome Langley had laid out for her. That afternoon, right on time as always, the bell over the door rang and Weston walked in. Rosa was sitting behind the counter, her eyes fixed on nothing, one hand resting on the cold glass surface. Weston paused for a second when he saw the crumpled paper in the trash. He said nothing, asked nothing, but something changed in those ice-blue eyes. It wasn't pity, Rosa realized. It was respect. He stepped to the counter, and Rosa looked up at him, her voice weary but not weak. "I'm about to lose everything." Weston looked at her, and his gaze didn't leave hers for even a second. "You haven't lost it yet." Rosa shook her head. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," he said, his voice low and steady in a way Rosa had never heard before. He placed his hand on the counter near hers, but didn't touch her. "You don't have to face this alone." Then he straightened, offered no explanation, said nothing more, and walked out the door as he did every afternoon. She didn't know that it was the last time she would ever see him looking like an ordinary customer. On the 22nd day, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Boston was already dark as ink. Rosa was standing behind the counter, trying to repair a clock with her borrowed tools, when the headlights of several vehicles swept across the glass front. She looked up, and her heart tightened at once. Jerome stepped out of the black SUV, but this time he hadn't come alone. 5 large men followed behind him, their faces hard as stone, and Rosa knew immediately that there would be no negotiation tonight. Jerome pushed the door open and walked in, his eyes scanning the counter, searching for the paper he had left behind. When he saw the trash can with the crumpled document inside, his face flushed red, and the veins in his neck rose sharply beneath his skin. "You refused my offer?" His voice no longer carried the false gentleness of the earlier visits. This was his real voice now, cold and dangerous. Rosa straightened her back, her hand gripping the edge of the counter to stop it from shaking. "I'm not signing." Jerome tilted his head and looked at her as though he were studying an insect about to be crushed. "Do you know what happens when people refuse me? I don't care." Rosa's voice came out clear and steady, even though inside she was so frightened she wanted to run. Jerome laughed, a dry sound that never reached his eyes. He signaled to his men, and they began to move. One shoved over a glass display case, and the crash of shattering glass split through the room. Another swept everything off the workbench onto the floor. The clocks Rosa had worked so hard to repair fell and struck the wood below, the sound of metal hitting the floor like cries of pain. Rosa rushed forward to try to stop them, but a heavy arm shoved her down onto the ground, and her back slammed against the base of the counter with a sharp burst of pain. Jerome walked through the wrecked shop, his hand gliding over the shelves as though he were admiring his own destruction. Then he stopped when he saw the pocket watch lying on the counter, the one Rosa had just finished servicing for Weston. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and his gold tooth flashed when he smiled. "Nice watch. Antique Swiss, right? Worth something." Rosa struggled to get back to her feet, panic rising in her voice. "Give it back. That isn't mine." Jerome slipped the watch into his coat pocket, his eyes on her with open satisfaction. "Call it interest. You owe me more than that." He turned to his men, his voice going cold as ice. "She doesn't want to cooperate. Take her." Rosa didn't have time to react. 2 large men grabbed her by the arms and dragged her out of the shop through the back door. She fought, she screamed, but she was far too weak against them. The alley behind the building was nearly black, lit only faintly by the distant wash of a street lamp. And at the end of the alley, a white truck was waiting, its engine still running, its back doors open wide like a dark mouth. Rosa saw the truck, and everything inside her froze. A memory from many years earlier crashed over her like a wave she couldn't stop. She remembered the phone call on the morning she was 8 years old, the strange voice from the hospital, cold and detached, telling her that her father hadn't survived the truck accident. She remembered standing there with the phone in her hand, not understanding, not believing, unable to cry. And now the truck in front of her felt like a ghost from the past, dragging her back to that day. "No," Rosa fought even harder. "Let go of me! Let me go!" But they didn't stop. They threw her into the back of the truck, and the metal doors slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed everything. Rosa curled into the corner of the truck, her back pressed against the freezing metal wall, her whole body shaking out of control. Her chest tightened, her lungs felt crushed, and she couldn't breathe. She wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to pull air into herself, but it was as if the air refused to enter her lungs. The darkness around her thickened, and she felt as though she were sinking, falling, disappearing. From the window of the grocery store, Bernie stood watching the scene with horror in his eyes. He saw Rosa dragged out of the shop, saw her forced into the truck, saw the vehicle pull away and vanish into the night. His old hand trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the business card the red-haired man had given him weeks before. He dialed the number, his heart pounding wildly. "They took her," he said, his voice shaking. "White truck, heading south." There was 1 second of silence on the other end of the line, and then a cold voice answered, "Understood." Hugh ended the call and turned to look at Weston. They were seated in a luxurious room on the highest floor of a building in downtown Boston, surrounded by the 5 most powerful men in the city. In the middle of the most important meeting of the year, Hugh said only one sentence: "They took her." And Weston rose to his feet. The 5 most powerful men in Boston watched Weston Draven rise from his seat in the middle of the meeting, stunned, unable to believe what they were seeing. This was the most important territorial meeting of the year. The room where decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were made, where the boundaries of power were redrawn, and Weston Draven, the coldest man among them, the one who had never let anything interfere with business, was standing up and walking toward the door. One of the men spoke, his voice edged with shock and irritation. "Where are you going? We're not finished." Weston didn't turn back. He didn't answer. He simply pushed open the door and walked out. Hugh followed right behind him, phone already pressed to his ear, his voice clipped and razor sharp. "All cars, now." It was the first time in 10 years that Weston Draven had walked out of a meeting before it ended. 3 black cars tore through the streets of Boston like bullets ripping through the night. Snow was falling, white flakes spinning in the headlights, the road slick and dangerous, but the drivers didn't slow down. Weston sat in the back seat, spine straight, eyes fixed ahead, not a trace of emotion on his face. But the hand resting on his thigh was clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Hugh sat in the front seat, his phone still at his ear, receiving updates from the men tailing the truck. 5 minutes, he said without turning around. "The truck is heading toward the industrial district in the South End." Weston didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jerome's white truck was driving down the empty road, leading toward the outskirts, when everything changed in a single instant. Without warning, 3 black cars appeared from 3 different directions, blocking the road as if they had risen straight out of the ground. The truck driver slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding across the thin sheet of ice covering the road, the scream of rubber against pavement piercing the air. The truck stopped less than 2 yards from the black car in the center. The doors opened, and 12 men in black suits stepped out at the same time, their movements synchronized and precise like a military unit trained for years. The door of the center car opened, and Weston Draven stepped out. But this wasn't the man in the worn bomber jacket who had sat in the corner of Rosa's shop every afternoon. This man wore a perfectly tailored black 3-piece suit that fit his tall frame like armor. A crisp white shirt, open at the collar with no tie, revealing the strong line of his neck and collarbone. His black hair was still immaculate despite the fierce wind, and his ice-blue eyes were colder than the snow falling around him. This wasn't a customer bringing in a watch for repair. This was the Frost, the man all of Boston knew by name, the man no one dared challenge. Jerome climbed down from the truck cab, his 5 men following behind him, but the confidence he always carried had vanished from his face. He looked at Weston, and Rosa could see through the narrow opening in the truck that the blood drained from his face, his skin turning ashen white. "Draven?" His voice shook, stripped of the swagger he had worn before. "What are you doing here?" Weston didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply walked toward the truck, each step slow and certain, like a predator advancing on prey that had already been cornered. Hugh went to the back doors of the truck and pulled them open wide. Light flooded in from outside, blinding Rosa after so long in the dark. She was curled in the corner, her knees clutched to her chest, her whole body still shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes were red, her hair loose and disheveled, and she looked up with the eyes of an animal driven to the edge. Then she saw him. Weston was standing there, just outside the truck, looking in at her. But this wasn't the Weston she knew. This man radiated a terrifying kind of authority, a force she had never felt from him before. This was someone else, someone dangerous, someone the whole city feared. Weston held out his hand to her, palm open, waiting. Rosa looked at that hand, the same hand that had once rested lightly on her shoulder in the shop, the same hand that had lifted a teacup every afternoon. Trembling, she placed her hand in his, and Weston drew her out of the truck gently, carefully, as if she were something precious that could shatter at any moment. Once she was steady on the ground, he removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his body heat still lingering in the fabric. Rosa looked up at him, her voice a ragged whisper. "Who are you?" Weston looked down at her, and for a single moment those ice-blue eyes softened, only for an instant, only when they rested on her. "That question can wait. Right now, you're safe." He turned to Hugh, his voice returning to its usual coldness. "Take her to the car." Then he looked back at Jerome, who stood there with his men, trembling in the middle of a ring of 12 men in black suits. And for the first time in his life, Jerome Langley understood what it meant to stand before his own ending. Weston walked toward Jerome, each step slow and certain, the sound of his leather shoes striking clearly against the frozen road. Every footfall was like a count in a countdown, marking the approach of Jerome Langley's unavoidable end. The fat creditor staggered backward, his steps clumsy on the ice, and his men retreated with him, survival instinct stronger than any loyalty they might have claimed to have. No one dared stand between the frost and his prey. No one was foolish enough to try. Weston stopped less than 3 feet from Jerome, his ice-blue eyes looking down at the trembling man before him. "She is in my territory." Jerome tried to steady his voice, but the tremor still slipped through every word. "I didn't know. The shop is in the gray zone, Draven. No one claimed it. I thought it was open ground." "She is not gray zone." Weston's voice cut through the air, cold and absolute. "She is mine." Jerome swallowed hard, his eyes darting around in search of an escape. But 12 men in black suits had already surrounded him on every side. "Draven, listen to me. Let me explain. This is just a misunderstanding. I can compensate you. We can negotiate." Weston tilted his head and looked at him, his gaze holding not even the smallest trace of mercy. "Explain what? That you've threatened her for weeks? That you've destroyed her shop? That you've had men pose as inspectors to seize her tools? That you kidnapped her right in front of me?" Each question cut into Jerome like a blade, and the creditor flinched with every word. Jerome dropped to his knees, both knees striking the frozen pavement, his hands raised in surrender. "I was wrong. I admit it. I was wrong. I'll make it right. Double it. Triple what she owes. Anything you want." Weston looked down at the man kneeling at his feet, and nothing changed in his eyes. "You think this is about money?" Jerome looked up, desperation raw in his face. "I can give you anything. I have connections. I have resources. We can work together." Weston bent down until his face was only inches from Jerome's, and the creditor could see the complete and merciless cold inside those ice-blue eyes. "You touched the one thing that matters most to me. There isn't enough money in this world to pay for that." Weston straightened and turned to Hugh, his voice calm again, almost as if he were giving instructions in an ordinary meeting. "Take back everything he stole from her. Her tools, the watches, everything. Check his warehouse, and if you have to, search his house too." Hugh nodded without a word, and motioned for several of Weston's men to head toward Jerome's truck. Weston looked back at Jerome, still kneeling on the road, shaking like a wounded animal. "Your assets, I am seizing. Your organization, dissolved. From this moment on, you have nothing left in Boston." He paused, letting the words sink into the man's bones. "You have 24 hours to leave this city." Jerome lifted his head, his eyes wide with shock. 24 hours? I built everything here over 20 years. My houses, my contacts, everything. Weston looked at him without the slightest flicker of feeling. "And I could make you lose it all in 24 minutes if I wanted to. Be grateful I'm giving you the chance to leave." Jerome's men didn't wait for the conversation to end. They had already broken apart, scattering into the darkness like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Jerome forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand, his face as pale as death. He looked at Weston one last time, and there was no cunning left in his eyes now, no swagger, no arrogance, only the pure fear of a man who had just looked into an abyss. Then he turned, staggered away, and vanished into the winter night of Boston. One of Weston's men stepped forward holding a small pouch taken from Jerome's coat pocket. Hugh opened it, checked inside, then gave Weston a small nod. Inside was the Swiss pocket watch, the same watch Rosa had repaired with all the care and devotion in her heart. Weston took it and looked at it for a long moment, his thumb moving slowly across the glass, as though checking whether it had been damaged. Then he slipped it into his coat pocket and turned back toward the car where Rosa was waiting. Snow was still falling, laying a thin white cover over the road where Jerome had just knelt and begged. Jerome was gone, but the night was not over yet. The black car moved smoothly through the streets of Boston, while snow continued to fall beyond the darkened windows. Rosa sat curled into one corner of the back seat, Weston's suit jacket still draped over her shoulders, the warmth of the fine wool not nearly enough to stop her body from trembling, but she knew she wasn't shaking from the cold. She was shaking because of what had just happened, because of what she had just seen, because the man sitting across from her was no longer the man she had thought she knew. Weston sat on the other side, leaving just enough distance between them, as if he understood that she needed space to make sense of everything that had happened. Rosa looked at him, at the flawless black suit, at the cold face the whole city feared, and she asked, her voice rough from too much crying, "Who are you? Who are you really?" Weston was silent for a moment, his ice-blue eyes turned toward the window, toward the falling snow, toward the blurred streetlights flickering past. Then he looked back at her and answered, his voice no longer cold the way it had been with Jerome, but low and tired. "Weston Draven. People call me the Frost." Rosa drew in a sharp breath. The Frost. She repeated the name as though trying to force it to fit the man who had sat in her shop every afternoon, drinking tea and listening to her stories. "The man who controls North Boston?" Weston nodded, making no attempt to deny it or explain it away. Rosa felt her back press instinctively against the car door, her survival instinct urging her to put more distance between them. "Have you hurt people?" she asked, her voice trembling, though her eyes never left his. She needed to know. She needed to hear the answer from his own mouth. Weston didn't look away, didn't lower his head, didn't evade her. "I've done terrible things. Rosa, I'm not a good man." There was no excuse in his voice, no apology, only stripped bare truth. "I've done things you wouldn't want to know. I've become the man my father wanted me to become." Tears slid down Rosa's cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "Then why?" Her voice broke. "Why did you come to my shop? Why did you pretend to be an ordinary customer?" Weston looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes, a brief softness Rosa had never seen before. "I wasn't pretending. When I was in your shop, that was the only time I got to be myself." Rosa shook her head, not understanding. He continued, his voice lower now, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "Everyone is afraid of me, Rosa, or they want something from me. Money, power, protection. No one looks at me without calculating something. No one stays near me without an agenda." He paused, his eyes locked with hers. "Except you. You never asked who I was, never demanded anything, never feared me when you were with me. You just made tea and let me sit there." Rosa fell silent, not knowing what to say. She looked at the man before her, trying to reconcile the image of the Frost with the Weston, who had sat in silence in her shop for the past 3 months. "Why did you save me?" she asked, the final question, the one that mattered most. Weston was silent for a long time. Then he slipped a hand into his coat pocket and drew out the pocket watch, the antique Swiss watch Rosa had repaired with all the care in her heart. He held it in his palm, his eyes on the glass face with something Rosa could only call longing. "Because you're the only person who ever touched this without asking how much it was worth." Rosa looked at the watch, remembering the first day he had brought it in, the way he had looked at it as if he were looking at a loved one who was gone. "Does it mean that much to you?" Weston nodded, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "It's the only thing I have left of my mother." Rosa lifted her eyes to his, and the fear in them was gone now, replaced by surprise and a quiet ache. "Your mother. She died when I was young," Weston said, his voice dry and flat. Then he fell silent, saying nothing more, as if what he had already shared was too much, as if he wasn't ready to open that part of himself any further. Rosa looked at him, not as the Frost, not as the powerful ruler of North Boston, but as Weston, the man who had lost his mother when he was still a boy, the man who kept her watch like his final treasure, and for the first time, she wanted to know more. Weston tapped lightly on the glass partition in front of the driver, signaling for him to stop the car. The black sedan slowly pulled over to the curb and came to a halt beside the Charles River. Beyond the misted window, snow was still falling softly, white flakes spiraling through the glow of the streetlights before settling onto the frozen river, glittering like millions of diamonds beneath the pale moonlight. Boston at night had a strange kind of beauty, quiet and peaceful, as though everything that had just happened had been nothing more than a dream. Rosa and Weston sat in the car, looking out at the night through the fogged glass, and for a long while neither of them said a word. Then Rosa spoke, her voice gentle now, no longer trembling as it had before. "Tell me about her." Weston turned to look at her, and a flicker of surprise passed through his ice-blue eyes. In all the years behind him, no one had ever asked him about his mother. People asked about his power, his territory, his deals, and his enemies. But no one asked about Isabella Draven, the woman who had given birth to him and loved him until her final breath. This was the first time anyone had asked him this, and he knew Rosa wasn't asking out of curiosity, but because she truly wanted to know. He was silent for a moment, as though searching for words that had been buried too long beneath memory. "My mother's name was Isabella. She was Italian, born in a small village near Florence." He paused, his gaze turned toward nothing, toward memories far away. "She was a painter. She painted beautifully. Flowers, the sea, the things she found beautiful in life. Her room always smelled of oil paint and lavender." Rosa listened without interrupting, without asking more. She simply sat there, giving him the space to speak, to remember. Weston continued, his voice deeper now. "She met my father before he became what he later turned into. Back then he was just a young Irish man with big dreams. She loved him, truly loved him." He drew in a long breath. "And then one day she woke up beside a crime lord. My father changed, or maybe he only became more fully who he had always been. But by then it was too late for her to leave." Rosa asked, her voice as light as breath. "Was she happy?" Weston slowly shook his head. "I don't know. She never said. But I remember she used to cry alone in her studio when she thought no one could see her." He paused, swallowing something thick in his throat. "She always tried to shield me from my father's world. She taught me to paint, taught me to read, taught me that there were things in life more important than power and money. But my father wouldn't allow it. He said she was making me weak." Weston took the pocket watch from his coat and held it in his palm, his thumb moving slowly over the glass face as if caressing someone he loved. "She gave me this on the last birthday before she died. She was already very sick then, but she still tried to hold on until my birthday, so she could give me a gift." His voice trembled slightly. "She told me, in a voice that was weak but still as warm as ever, that every second that passes is a second you can choose to do the right thing, that it's never too late to become the person you want to be." He stopped, his eyes lowered to the watch. "That was the last thing she ever said to me. A week later, she was gone." He fell silent for a long moment, then spoke again, his voice bitter now. "I didn't listen to her. After she died, I became exactly what my father wanted me to become. Cold, ruthless, without feeling." He looked up, his eyes meeting Rosa's. "I grew up believing this world was divided into the strong and the weak, that emotion was the one weakness that could destroy a man. My father taught me that every day, until I believed it the way I believed in the air I breathed." Rosa looked at him, then at the watch in his hand. "But you still kept the watch." Weston nodded, a bitter smile brushing across his mouth. "It was the only thing no one could take from me. My father took everything that belonged to my mother after she died, burned all her paintings, threw away all her belongings, as if she had never existed. But I hid this watch. I've kept it with me for 20 years. Rosa felt her heart tighten. "When I repaired this watch," she said, remembering the way she had handled every gear, every tiny screw with such care. Weston nodded, cutting in softly. "You touched it like it was something alive. You didn't ask how much it was worth, didn't ask why I wanted to fix an old watch like that. You only looked at it and said it mattered to me." He looked at her. "No one had ever done that before." Rosa said quietly, "You miss her." Weston nodded, but he couldn't speak. This was the first time in years he had spoken about his mother to anyone. The first time he had allowed himself to remember her not in loneliness and darkness, but with another person sitting beside him. And the feeling was both painful and freeing in a way he couldn't put into words. Rosa didn't think. She simply acted on instinct. Her small hand reached out and rested gently over his, over the fingers holding the watch. Weston looked down, looked at her hand on his, and something trembled in those ice-blue eyes, something beginning to melt. Rosa spoke, her voice steady despite its softness. "Your mother would be proud of you tonight. You saved someone. You chose to do the right thing. That's what she wanted." Weston turned his face away and looked out the window, looked at the falling snow. His shoulder trembled once, only for a second, only for that one brief moment in which he allowed himself to be vulnerable. Then he mastered himself, drew in a deep breath, and turned back to look at her. They sat there in silence, their hands still touching, and neither of them said anything more. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in a layer of pure white. No words were needed. For the first time in many years, both of them felt a little less alone. That night, on the bank of the Charles River, a crime lord and a clock repairer sat beside each other, and both of them knew that their lives would never be the same again. After Weston finished telling the story of his mother, after the silence had lasted long enough for his words to settle, Rosa began to cry, not with loud, broken sobs, but with quiet tears slipping down her cheeks, impossible to stop, impossible to control. She wasn't crying out of fear, even though tonight she had lived through the kind of terror that felt capable of killing her. She wasn't crying out of pity for Weston either, because she knew he didn't need anyone's pity. She cried because everything she had forced herself to carry for so many years had finally broken open tonight. She cried for her father, the man she had lost when she was still too young to understand what loss really meant. She cried for her grandfather, the man who had taught her everything she knew and then left her too. She cried for her mother, lying weak and alone in the hospital. She cried for the past 3 months with Jerome, for the fear, for the feeling of being driven into a corner. She cried for tonight, for the truck, for the memories that had come crashing back. Everything shattered all at once, and there was nothing she could do except let it flow. Weston didn't say anything. He didn't comfort her with empty words, didn't tell her everything would be all right, didn't promise things he couldn't be sure of. He simply sat there, his hand still resting beneath hers, warm and steady. His presence was enough. His silence was enough. When the tears had eased a little, Rosa spoke, her voice rough but calmer now. My father died when I was little, a truck accident on his way home from work. Weston turned to look at her, listening without interrupting. Rosa continued, her eyes fixed on nothing, fixed on memory. I got the phone call from the hospital, a strange voice, cold and distant, telling me he didn't make it. I just stood there holding the phone, not understanding, not believing. She drew in a trembling breath. That's why I panicked when they locked me in the truck tonight. The memory kept coming back, like it had happened only yesterday. Weston nodded slowly, his eyes on her with the kind of understanding only people who had lived through loss could ever have. I understand. Rosa lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time she saw the resemblance between them, the invisible thread connecting two people who should have been utterly different. You lost your mother. I lost my father. We both lost someone we loved when we were far too young. She paused. Maybe that's why you understand me, and why I understand you. Weston looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. You're not alone anymore, Rosa. Rosa smiled through her tears, a small smile but a real one. Neither are you. And for the first time in all the time Rosa had known him, Weston smiled. It was only a small smile, almost impossible to see, only the faintest curve at one corner of his mouth. But it was real, not the cold expression he usually wore like a mask. And that smile warmed his ice-blue eyes, made his face look younger, softer. Weston tapped lightly on the glass partition, signaling the driver. Take us back to the watch shop in the North End. The car began to move, but before they had gone far, Weston turned to Rosa. Your mother needs surgery. I'll take care of it. Rosa shook her head immediately, her instinct for independence making her resist at once. I can't accept that. It's too much money. Weston looked at her, and his gaze allowed no argument, though it wasn't cold. This isn't charity. This is me paying a debt. Rosa frowned. Paying what debt? You don't owe me anything. Weston slowly shook his head. You repaired my mother's watch after it had been broken for years. You gave me somewhere to go every day, somewhere I could be myself. You reminded me of who I used to be, before my father turned me into what I became. He paused. To me, that's a debt I can never fully repay. Rosa said nothing more. She only nodded and accepted it, because she understood this wasn't about money. It was about something much deeper than that. The car stopped in front of Hayward & Sons timepieces. Rosa stepped out, her feet touching the snow-covered sidewalk, and she turned back to look at Weston, who was still sitting inside the car. "You'll come back, won't you?" Weston looked at her, his ice blue eyes warmer than they had ever been. "If you still want me to." Rosa smiled. "Don't be late." Weston nodded, and the car door closed. Rosa stepped into the shop and stopped right at the threshold. Her grandfather's tools had been returned, arranged neatly on the workbench. The magnifying loupe, the Swiss screwdriver set, the old desk lamp, everything was there, almost completely intact. Rosa stood in the middle of her shop, looked around, and realized she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a very long time, she had someone standing on her side. And when she looked out the window, the black car was still parked at the corner of the street, silent and patient. Weston hadn't left. He was still there, keeping watch. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and everything had changed. Hayward and Sons timepieces now looked like a renewed version of itself, still holding on to its old soul but filled with fresh life. The red brick facade had been cleaned and repainted, and the new glass front shone brightly, reflecting the spring sunlight of Boston. The wooden sign that read Hayward and Sons timepieces had been polished with care, and the letters that had once faded were now sharp and clear again, just as they had been on the first day Grandpa Antonio hung it there. Inside the shop, her grandfather's tools were displayed with quiet honor in their own glass case: the magnifying loupe, the Swiss screwdriver set, the brass desk lamp, all of them placed carefully like treasures in a small museum, reminding Rosa of the man who had passed on everything to her. Penny Hayward, Rosa's mother, had come through the surgery successfully and had been discharged from the hospital 2 months earlier. She now lived with her daughter in the small apartment behind the shop, a place that had been renovated and expanded with one more room. Every morning, she sat by the window looking out into the shop, watching her daughter work on the clocks, and she smiled. Sometimes she came out to help, straightening the display shelves or making tea for customers. But most of the time she simply sat there, enjoying the gift of being near her daughter after so many months in a hospital bed. Rumors spread all through the North End that Rosa Hayward, the small clock repairer on the street corner, was under the protection of the Frost. No one knew exactly what stood between them, and no one dared ask. But everyone knew that causing trouble for Rosa meant causing trouble for the most powerful man in North Boston, and no one was foolish enough to do that. The customers came back, more than before Jerome had ever appeared. Some came because they truly needed watches repaired, and some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the girl the Frost cared about. But whatever the reason, the shop was lively again. Old Bernie still came by every morning, bringing a cup of coffee and a smile, happy that his granddaughter had finally found a better life. And every afternoon, right on time, as though some invisible clock were counting down the hours, the shop door opened, and Weston stepped inside. He no longer wore the old bomber jacket. Instead, he came in elegant black suits, but he always took off his jacket the moment he sat down in the familiar chair in the corner of the shop, as if that were his way of shedding the shell of the Frost and returning to being Weston. Rosa always prepared unsweetened black tea for him in advance, and set it on the small table beside the chair. And sometimes Hugh stood outside the door, nodding a greeting to her through the glass before returning to his post. One late spring afternoon, as the sunlight began to fade and the glow of sunset washed the whole shop in gold, Rosa placed a small box wrapped in black paper in front of Weston. He looked at the box, then at her, his ice blue eyes filled with quiet curiosity. Rosa smiled. "A gift for you." Weston opened the box, and inside was a pocket watch. Not an antique, not a collector's piece. It was a completely new watch, with a gleaming silver case, a crystal-clear glass face, and a second hand moving in a gentle ticking rhythm. But its design was exactly like his mother's watch, every detail, every line, as if someone had copied it perfectly. Weston looked up at Rosa, his voice full of surprise. "You made this?" Rosa nodded, her gray-blue eyes shining. "It took 3 months. I studied your mother's watch, measured every detail, and built this one by hand from the beginning. It's exactly like the old one, but completely new, so you can carry it without being afraid of damaging her keepsake." Weston looked down at the watch in his hand, his fingers brushing the glass, and Rosa could see him trying to keep his emotions under control. Then he looked up, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "How much?" Rosa smiled, that smile he had come to know so well over the past 6 months. "Free." Weston shook his head. "Nothing is free." Rosa tilted her head, a playful light in her eyes. "There is one condition. You have to come back here every day to receive it. Every minute, every second, every afternoon. Weston looked at her, and for the first time Rosa saw him truly smile. Not the small, almost invisible smile from before, but a warm smile that lit his whole face, that melted the cold from his ice-blue eyes. Every day? Rosa nodded, her smile bright. Every day. 6 months earlier, Rosa hadn't known that the ordinary customer who stepped into her shop would change her life forever. 6 months later, she couldn't imagine her life without him. Never be kind to strangers. That was the rule for survival in Boston. Don't look, don't ask, don't care. That was what people had told Rosa Hayward for years. But she broke all 3 rules. She invited a stranger into her shop, let him sit in the corner every afternoon, and made tea for him without asking who he was. She repaired his watch with all her heart without asking how much it was worth. She opened her heart to a man the entire city feared, and because of that, she was saved. Not because she was weak and needed someone to shield her, but because her kindness awakened something good inside a man who had seemed to lose everything that was good in him. In a world this full of darkness, light doesn't come from the sun. It doesn't come from powerful people, from money, or from glittering promises. Light comes from the people who still choose kindness, even when they have no reason to be kind. It comes from hearts that remain open, even after being wounded too many times. It comes from the belief that people can change, that beneath a cold and hardened shell, there can still be a heart capable of love. And sometimes, the most dangerous person is the safest one to trust. Rosa stood in her shop, the warm light shining through the new glass door and falling across the clocks, ticking steadily on the walls. Outside, Boston winter had passed, the snow had stopped falling, and the city was moving into the first days of spring. The ticking of hundreds of clocks rose like a familiar symphony, like hundreds of hearts beating together, reminding her of what her grandfather had always said. And Rosa smiled, because she knew that in just a few minutes, the door would open, and he would walk in. Fate doesn't knock with a loud sound, or arrive with grand declarations. Sometimes it comes in the shape of an ordinary customer carrying a watch that stopped beating long ago. Sometimes it wears an old coat and drinks unsweetened black tea. Sometimes it has ice-blue eyes and a faint scar on its chin. And if you're brave enough to open the door, kind enough to invite it in, and patient enough to wait, fate will change everything. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button and share the video so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next moving stories we bring you each day. We'd truly love to know how you feel about Rosa and Weston's story. Please leave a comment below and share with us the feelings that rose from the deepest part of your heart. Every comment you leave is a precious encouragement that helps us continue creating more meaningful content. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.